Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the interesting story of the Queen of Sheba, a legendary figure who pops up in the Bible, the Quran, and even in Ethiopian traditions. She's famous for her journey to Jerusalem, where she wanted to test King Solomon's wisdom face to face. So, here's the basic rundown. The Queen of Sheba is first mentioned in the Bible, in Kings and 2 Chronicles. The story goes that she was a powerful monarch who heard about Solomon's incredible wisdom and decided to see if all the hype was true. She brought along lavish gifts, probably thinking, let's see if this king is as wise as they say. Now, we don't have any archaeological evidence to confirm she existed, no statues, no inscriptions, nothing. It's mainly through these ancient texts that her story survives. But where exactly was Sheba? Well, the region is generally linked to the kingdom of Saba, which was located in southern Arabia. Some, however, argue that she was from Ethiopia, and this debate has been going on for ages. The historian Flavius Josephus even claimed she ruled over both Ethiopia and Egypt. But when you look at the timeline, it's more likely she was a ruler from southern Arabia, as no Ethiopian monarch from that period is known to have existed. Now, the Ethiopian connection probably stems from later writings, especially in works like the Kebra Negast, which ties the queen to Ethiopia and the kingdom of Aksum. But here's the catch. Aksum didn't even exist when Solomon was around. It only became a powerful kingdom centuries later. Before Aksum, there was a kingdom called Mount, which had a lot of Sabaean influence from southern Arabia. So it's possible that over time, the Queen of Sheba's story got mixed up with these different regions and cultures. Whether she was from Ethiopia or Arabia, one thing's clear: Saba, the kingdom in southern Arabia, was a major trading hub back then. It makes sense that they'd have connections across the Red Sea. In fact, some suggest that the Queen of Sheba could have been a Sabaean ruler from Mount, and her legend eventually got tied to Ethiopia by writers like Josephus. Or, of course, there's the possibility she never existed at all and is just a legend. But given how her story has persisted for so long, many think there was probably some historical figure behind it all. Now, back to the Bible. The books of Kings and 2 Chronicles tell us that Solomon, after becoming king, asked God for wisdom to rule. God granted him wisdom along with wealth and fame. When the Queen of Sheba heard about this, she decided to see if Solomon was really all that wise. She came to Jerusalem to test him with some hard questions. When Solomon answered everything to her satisfaction, she was so impressed that she gave him tons of gifts, 120 talents of gold, tons of spices, and precious stones. Just to give you an idea, 120 talents of gold would be worth over 3.5 million today. The Bible emphasizes the huge amount of spices she brought, which makes sense because Saba was known for its spice trade, especially after the 8th century BCE. After their meeting, Solomon gave the queen whatever she asked for, and she returned to her country. And in later versions of her tale, like the one found in the Targum Sheni, things get a bit more elaborate. The Targum Sheni is an Aramaic translation of the Book of Esther, and while that book is mostly about a different story, it includes a version of the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, adding more mythological elements. In this version, Solomon's wisdom isn't just about ruling well. He can actually communicate with animals, birds, and even trees. So, in the Targum Sheni, Solomon throws a massive feast and invites all the animals and birds to attend. Everyone's on board except for one, a woodcock. This bird straight up refuses, claiming that Solomon isn't as great as the Queen of Sheba and doesn't deserve that kind of respect. Solomon, of course, doesn't take that lightly. He sends an invitation to the Queen of Sheba, asking her to come to his palace and prove the woodcock wrong. And just to make an even bigger impression, Solomon has one of his spirits transport her throne all the way to his palace. When the queen arrives, she walks across a floor made of glass, which looks like water, and is immediately impressed by Solomon's grandeur. But, being sharp and curious, she still tests him with some tough riddles. Naturally, Solomon answers all of them with ease. She ends up paying homage to him. And as for that woodcock? Well, it's safe to assume he was finally satisfied. This version of the story comes from a genre known as the midrash, a collection of rabbinic commentaries that add layers to biblical tales. The Targum Sheni has been dated anywhere from the 4th to 11th century CE, depending on which scholar you ask. Some even suggest that the Quran might have picked up parts of this story from the Targum Sheni, since Islamic texts often borrow from earlier traditions. Now, speaking of the Quran, let's jump to that version of the Queen of Sheba's story. In the Quran, she's referred to as Bilqis and is the ruler of the powerful kingdom of Sheba. Similar to the biblical version, Solomon, who is known as Suleiman in the Quran, has the gift of talking to birds, animals, and even jinn, or spirits. One day, Solomon notices that the hoopoe bird is missing from his assembly and threatens to punish it unless it provides a good reason for its absence. The hoopoe shows up and tells Solomon about this remarkable land of Sheba, ruled by a woman with a magnificent throne. But the bird also reports that the people of Sheba worship the sun instead of God. Solomon, seeing a chance to convert them, sends the bird back with a letter to the queen, inviting her to submit to his god, Allah. When Bilqis receives the letter, she gathers her advisors to discuss what to do. They suggest they're ready to fight if needed, but Bilqis decides to take a more diplomatic approach. She sends Solomon a gift, hoping that might smooth things over. However, Solomon rejects the gift and sends a message back, warning that if she doesn't comply, he'll bring an army she won't be able to resist. After this, Solomon remembers the hoopoe's mention of the queen's throne and asks his council who can bring it to him before she arrives. One of the jinn takes up the challenge and brings her throne to Solomon. When Bilqis finally arrives at Solomon's palace, she's amazed by what she sees, especially when Solomon asks her if the disguised throne in front of her is hers. She's puzzled but says it looks just like hers. Then she's invited into a pavilion made of crystal clear glass. Thinking it's water, she lifts her dress to wade through, only to realize it's just an illusion. Overwhelmed by Solomon's wisdom and the wonders she's witnessed, Bilqis admits that she had been wrong in worshipping other gods and submits to Solomon's god, Allah. While the Quran ends the story here, Islamic traditions later suggest that Bilqis may have married Solomon, though that part is more of a legend than an official part of the Quran. And now let's dive into the version of the Queen of Sheba's story from the Kebra Negast, an important Ethiopian text. In this version, the queen is named Makeda and she rules over Ethiopia. Her curiosity about King Solomon begins when a merchant named Tamarin, who had been to Jerusalem, returns with incredible stories. Tamarin had traveled there as part of an expedition, bringing supplies from Ethiopia for the construction of Solomon's temple. He couldn't stop talking about Solomon's wisdom and the magnificence of Jerusalem, calling it the most amazing city he had ever seen. Naturally, Queen Makeda was intrigued. She decided she had to see this wonder for herself. She packed up gifts for Solomon, and when she arrived, they exchanged lavish presents. The two spent hours in deep conversation, and eventually, Queen Makeda was so impressed that she converted to Judaism, embracing Solomon's God. Toward the end of her stay, Solomon threw a huge feast in her honor, and she stayed the night at his palace. Before they retired, Solomon swore he wouldn't touch her as long as she didn't take anything from him. Makeda agreed. However, in the middle of the night, she got thirsty and drank from a bowl of water that Solomon had left in the room. Solomon appeared and pointed out that she had technically stolen his water. At that point, Makeda allowed him to sleep with her since she had broken her word. Before she left Jerusalem, Solomon gave her his ring as a token to remember him by. On her way back to Ethiopia, Makeda gave birth to a son, whom she named Menelik, meaning son of the wise man. As Menelik grew older and started asking about his father, Makeda gave him Solomon's ring and told him to go meet his father. Menelik traveled to Jerusalem and was welcomed by Solomon, who was delighted to meet his son. Menelik stayed in Jerusalem for years, studying the Torah, but eventually it was time for him to return home. Solomon ordered that the firstborn sons of his nobles accompany Menelik back to Ethiopia, perhaps because they thought it would be better if he left. But before they left, one of the noble's sons stole the Ark of the Covenant from the temple and replaced it with a duplicate. Menelik had no idea this had happened until they were on their way back to Ethiopia. He wanted to return it, but the group convinced him that this was all part of God's plan, that the Ark was meant to go to Ethiopia. When Solomon found out, he was furious and sent his troops after them, but they couldn't catch up. Then Solomon had a dream where God told him that the Ark was supposed to be taken to Ethiopia, so he called off the chase. He told his priests and nobles to pretend that the replica in the temple was the real Ark. Menelik returned home with the Ark, which was enshrined in a temple, and according to legend, it remains in Ethiopia to this day. The Queen of Sheba's story continues to be retold in various forms, and even though we may never know if she was a real historical figure, her legend has endured across time, inspiring art, literature, and culture for thousands of years.